Appreciate everybody joining today. As usual, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A box, and I will do my very best to look up and see if we have any there. If not, I will catch them at the end. And today we're going to cover vulnerability management, kind of the 101. Vulnerability management from a scanning and remediation perspective is quite in depth. We could probably cover, half a dozen different sessions if we were to get into the weeds, but I'd like to at least do high level, make sure we're all on the same page, and then maybe at a future date we'll go a little more in depth. If you guys have never joined, my name is Jerry Craig, the CISO for Ntiva, background primarily in DoD and healthcare. And today we're going to talk about a couple items, kind of the components of a vulnerability management program, understanding that this is more than just simply scanning. It's an actual program within your security program, the stages and phases of the program, a vulnerability management lifecycle, pretty much everything, whether it's software development, system development, system replacement, whatever, they all have a life cycle. Vulnerability management is no different. A few miscellaneous items, and then some Q&A. So at a high level, three basic groups. Again, a lot of this is the way I look at it. So you could go out on the internet and do searches and maybe find someone telling you that there's 6 different components, 5 different components. You're probably never going to get an agreement on a number or their titles. But I think the 3 listed here and the fact that there's 2 items and each kind of covers the majority of them that everyone would agree, or at least a minimum requirement for a program. Those are policies and procedures, tools and people, and risk and compliance. And we'll talk about each of them a little bit more throughout the program here and throughout the presentation. But what we're really looking at is, what do you say you're doing? How do you say you're doing it? What's the evidence that you're doing it? What tools are you using? Who are the people that are involved in this process? And then why are you doing it? The why is probably the most important part, because when we talk about risk and compliance, there's an obvious component from an actual security perspective of, well, to be more secure, we have to remove vulnerabilities. Then there's also a compliance perspective, which many organizations, if not most organizations nowadays, have to comply with some form of compliance requirement. Whether it's the industry you work in and they have their own regulations, whether it's a contract that you support, someone is likely telling you, at worst, you must follow all these things. At best, this is a recommendation. And then when you start to get into the legal aspects and liability, even if someone's not mandating that you do something, should you know about these vulnerabilities, you do nothing about it, then you're compromised, and then you're going to be held legally liable for damages, whether that's monetary, criminal, etc. So none of these are more important than the other, but I would say that if you had to start anywhere with the program, starting with risk and compliance would be the first place I would go, simply because I would want to know, do I have to do something for someone? Is there some requirement? Because if you don't cover that part first, the rest of it may be built and look great on paper, but may not achieve the goals that you're trying to achieve. So let's talk about each of these individually. From a policies and procedures perspective, I tried to throw some questions up here you could ask yourself. And once you start answering these questions, you're going to find that the first question will then lead to another set of questions. And then depending on whether you say yes or no, or maybe partially, you're going to have another set. So it's going to grow well beyond 5 bullets. But for the sake of today's webinar, I tried to limit how many things we cover. So first and foremost, do you have a patch management policy? Do you have a scanning and remediation process? You could have, for argument's sake, you could have a program in place where you're going out and applying Microsoft updates every month. Great. Is that documented? And then are you actually doing it? And if you are you going out and scanning the host to see whether or not those patches and those updates are actually being applied, and the scanner is seeing those vulnerabilities come off of the vulnerability report? There's a lot of times that organizations will think, I've got this great patching program in place, I've got the tools, it's happening at whatever the frequency is, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and then someone goes and runs a scan report and they find out they have hundreds or thousands of vulnerabilities, and they're really confused because they're saying to themselves, I thought these were taken care of. But there was no actual QA in place to make sure that was being done. And then as we talk about each of these, think about the compliance component as well. So you might be doing it and you may have a very good system. Are you keeping records of this work? How do you provide evidence to an auditor if you want to get pass a certification? You want to pick up cyber insurance. You know, you can't go in there with just yesterday's scan and say, look, I've been doing it, because for all they know, that's the first time you've scanned. Or what if you did that scan and you suppressed things, didn't scan for everything, you did that just so that your scan would come back clean. If they see a trend, and this is where you see that, do you perform trend analysis? If they're seeing that trend over time, and you can say, look, I do this every quarter, and here's where I started 12 months ago, and look at where I am today. Not only does that provide evidence, but it also shows that you're committed to this. It shows you're moving in the right direction. And it'll let your management determine, are you moving in the right direction fast enough? It's one thing to say, I have 1,000 vulnerabilities and every month it goes down by 50. Okay, are you willing to wait 2 years for those vulnerabilities to come off the report? Because that's essentially how long it's going to take you should nothing change. If your goal is to get the vulnerabilities off in 6 months because maybe you have a compliance requirement on a contract, well, then you know from a trend analysis perspective, you're not on pace. And do you need to ramp up? Do you need to buy new hardware, hire more people, et cetera? Do you have vendor management procedures to deal with patching requirements across all application vendors? I've worked in very large enterprises with very large vendors, and you can go to 5 different vendors and say, can you provide your patch schedule and your release schedule? And every one of them has a different one. So one vendor might do it quarterly, one does it monthly, one does it weekly. Well, when you run your vulnerability scans and then you show the reports to someone, they're going to see this pattern where, wow, this vulnerability hangs around for a long time. Why does it take you 3 months to patch something when you say that you patch monthly? You've got to have evidence and something in writing saying, because I can only patch as fast as the vendor provides me those patches, and this vendor is on a quarterly schedule. Most of the time, when, just from experience, when people are seeing vulnerability scans for the first time or the first couple times, and they see how long a vulnerability has been in the environment, it's an assumption's made that people aren't doing their job, or they're being lied to and being told it's being done. So it would behoove the people who are doing the vulnerability work for you to get ahead of this and have these documents already in place, have evidence from the vendor, so that you can go and say, see, look, I'm going as fast as I can. Otherwise, it looks like you're just blaming the vendor. And the last thing you want to do is tell someone, well, the vendor releases quarterly, and then they go do a Google search and find out patches are given every Tuesday, right? That looks very bad. The next part that's a little bit easier is really your tools and people, because you can buy tools for this. You can outsource the work to an MSP or MSSP like Ntiva, where we buy the tools and manage it for you. The tooling part is really not that hard. It's more of a, you know, how much do I want to spend? There's obviously volume discounts and buying power when going through someone like an MSP versus doing it yourself. The bigger part of it is you have to have people who understand the scan reports and know how to remediate these findings if you're going to do it yourself. You can pay a professional services group to come in and deploy a tool for you. You can pay the licensing. You can probably automate most of your scans for the most part, with minor tweaking, additions, removals, suppression, and stuff like that, where you can get someone at low cost to come in and do that part for you. But then if you're presented with a report that has 500 vulnerabilities, and you have, let's say, a set of developers who are developing code, and you go to them and say, I need these taken care of. When will you remediate? How long? How do we make sure this is not going out in the next release of whatever code they developed? If they come back to you and go, I don't know how to do this. I know how to program. You tell me how to do it. Most companies will run into a problem of, how do I take care of that? And they don't have the skilled personnel. And quite honestly, it's difficult in one organization to even find one person who can do it, because you're going to be asking them to understand vulnerabilities across email configuration settings, custom code development, product upgrades. Most people by nature in IT and security have a niche area that they excel at, and then an overall broad knowledge base. So if the person is really good with network vulnerabilities, for example, and they know a lot about routers and switches and firewalls, and then you come and say, my code developer doesn't know how to fix a code vulnerability, the likelihood that the network person can help you is going to be slim to none. They're most likely just going to be Googling and hoping that someone else has put out in a forum, how did I remediate this? So these are things you have to consider if you're going to pull this in-house. And then how many people do you have, if any, that are responsible for patching systems and applications? One of the things that comes up a lot is, Microsoft patches, if you're going through an MSP like Ntiva, for example, can be done for you. But you go and install your own third-party app that you bought, some COTS application, you develop your own app. Who's doing that part for you? You're not going to have a vendor to go to necessarily and say, let me download their patch and apply it to my system. Even if you have that type of program in place, someone's going to have to go create it, test it, and deploy it to your code. And do you have it set up in a way that you can test in non-prod before you promote into the production environment? Do you have backups of systems? Do you have high redundancy and availability in case your patching breaks something? Do you have people who can test that code pre-production to make sure that the fixed the vulnerability but didn't break some aspect of the application? So there's a lot involved here beyond just buying the tool and hiring a person to do this for you. And last but not least, the risk and compliance part. Do you have a board or committee that reviews risks, assigns severities and priorities to vulnerabilities? So the first half of that is, do you have a board or committee, a C-suite, somebody or some group of people who you have to report this information up to? And do you assign the severity levels and priorities? Do they assign it? How do you quantify what it's going to take from a cost perspective to either buy the right tools, get the right upgrades, hire the right people, the amount of time it's going to take? And how do you prioritize this with all the other work that you invariably have already in your pipeline? Do you have a compliance requirement that guides your efforts? So we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but if you work for, let's say, certain aspects of the DoD or the federal government, maybe a broader example, they may say that they want critical vulnerabilities as defined by a CVSS score to be remediated within 14 days. You may have a compliance program and a patching program that says you scan and patch quarterly. Quarterly will not be enough to meet their 14-day timeline. I've experienced this before, and it creates quite an uproar in how you structure your team, how you do the business when you have outages, scheduling maintenance windows, the impact it has on all the people who use your assets, et cetera. And then what's the overall risk appetite within the organization? Some organizations will simply accept risk better and more often than others, which can be a good thing as far as it's less pressure on you, but it brings more risk and liability to the organization. Or do you have people who are sticklers? Maybe they came from an organization that was hacked as a result of not patching, and they're not going to see that happen again. And therefore, they're going to come down on you with the hammer, and it's going to be very difficult to implement and get on their timeline. And then, are you managing risk across all applications to include the custom-built apps, your on-prem apps, your cloud-hosted apps, or SaaS apps, as we call them? You have to consider that it's not just simply, Office products. You have a ton of applications. I think most organizations never do an actual software asset inventory or list. So they really have no idea how many apps they're talking about. And if I had to guess, most organizations would drastically under quantify what they have. They may sit down and say, well, we probably have 15, 20, 25 apps. But when you do an exhaustive search for all of the apps, you might have 200. Well, if you're planning your program around 20 apps, but there's 200, then one, your program's not going to cover all of your apps and all of your vulnerabilities, but two, the amount of time and effort that it's going to take to remediate and to report is going to be vastly different. So a lot to consider, but again, I put the highest precedence and importance on that last column, simply because if you do contractual work, if you have cyber insurance, whatever, you could stand to lose that work, be sued, lose your insurance, et cetera, if you're not meeting those requirements. So again, I would focus on that first and foremost. And then kind of stages or phases of a program. So I broke it down into, again, here's 4 that I came up with. You can Google and get all sorts of different responses to this, but they're all generally going to cover the same topics that are in these bullets. You're going to identify and assess, and that's where you're gathering all your subnets, your IP addresses, host information, location, credentials, et cetera. This is a great exercise because in the process of doing this, you might find out I have 5 locations, but I can only communicate with 4 from my central office. Well, if you can't communicate with the 5th, you're probably not patching the 5th, you can't scan the 5th, et cetera. Do the credentials work across all my assets? Do I have a common network account I use, or is it a local account on different assets? and local passwords change, and all of a sudden I go do a scan thinking my credentials worked, and it turns out they didn't. Will the scanner even pick up on that or just give you false results? Then prioritization. What order do I scan? How many scanners will I need? The stability of the assets. Are they almost, leveraged and pegged out from a CPU, RAM, hard disk perspective? Are they near 100% utilization at the time you want to scan? Do you need to scan in off hours and schedule that differently? There's pros and cons to all of this, right? Someone might say, well, logically, why don't we just do it in off hours? But off hours is also when people are doing maintenance cycles. Off hours is when some assets may not even be online. So you might not get a holistic picture of your vulnerability management profile. And then remediation. Now you've got all this data. You want to know, what do I do with it? Well, you've got to come up with timelines. Again, you have to go back to your risk appetite. You've got to prioritize this based on the other work that you have and the people who are now responsible to do this work and the work they were hired on initially to do. All your compliance requirements, your budget, your manpower, and then probably most importantly, whatever you've decided based on all of this, does it match your written policy? If not, you need to go back and update your written policy because, again, from an audit perspective, it makes no sense to say, here's what I do as an organization when the evidence speaks and tells a completely different story. You'd be better off to make your written policy match everything that we've talked about, even if the way it looks isn't as good. Someone may come in and go, wow, you really should be doing this more often. Okay. But at least you're being honest, and at least it matches, and at least your evidence will support your behaviors. And then finally, the reporting, determining key stakeholders, who needs this information, what type of reporting and formatting do they need, what's going to make sense to them. Every audience wants something different. What frequency and period do they want reporting done? Are you doing trend analysis, or is it a snapshot in time? What do you do with the data when you have the trend analysis? Can you make good use of it? Ranking and severity structures, detailed technical information versus executive publications. This is going to take some time to sit down and identify who all these folks are, understand, if you don't know them on a personal level, what they're looking for and what's needed at their role and their level within the organization, especially if you're going to be talking about board members and C-suite, and then probably having to custom tailor something for each of these groups, and then get on some cadence for, I ran my scan here, I took the data, I plugged it into these 3 PowerPoints for 3 different audiences, and I deliver it on this time frame. And one of the most important things I want to say here is ask yourself key questions along the line. What happens if I overlook or skip X? And X can be anything on this slide or anything else that's not on here. When you see a lot on a slide, or you start writing down an outline of all the things you need to do, and you come up with 100 things you need to do, I think human nature is to say, obviously I have to focus and prioritize, but there's going to come a point where most people just skip certain things. Either they feel it's not worth it, they don't know how to do it, they don't understand. The amount of time it takes to achieve that one thing is greater than achieving a bunch of other things, so it's not a priority to them. But you really need to stop and say, what happens when I skip this? In some cases, the risk is very low, and that makes sense because you're prioritizing. In other cases, it simply is that important, you can't skip it, and you have to make time. And depending on where you are in the organization and who you're reporting to, you may have to have tough conversations about, hey, look, nobody wants to spend the time and money on this, but here's the impact if we don't. And worst case, if you can't get buy-in, get it in writing that they told you, move on. And then vulnerability management lifecycle, again, common theme here. You can come up with as many steps as you want. I have 6 steps here. And the reason it's in a circle format is you're never done. This is an iterative process. The minute you get through the circle once, you just start over and you never stop going through the circle. So you're going to start with discovery. You need to be able to see and communicate with all the assets. That is the most important thing. If there are shadow IT that you're unaware of, if there's communication problems, there's firewall issues, if you can't see it and you can't communicate with it, then you're not going to have a good picture. And if your data is wrong out of the gate, I don't see how you can be successful. You need to assess what needs to be done. What am I finding? What are my problems? Where are the things that are coming up over and over? Why do I have the same things coming up over and over? Did I think I patched something and fixed it, but the reports aren't indicating that? Do I have a problem with my tool, or is it a problem with another process? A lot of times this is cross-departmental work. So if you're security and your oversight, you're not the one carrying out the work, you're the one reporting on it. And some other department's telling you, no, I do this. Look, okay, so then is their process broke? Is your tool broke? Reporting, again, this is kind of back to the slide before this. What types of reports will you have? Who do they go to? The frequency. This becomes the easiest one once you get past it, because once you define that, you're typically just going to reuse the same template and change the numbers that are in it. So that becomes a very quick process after you get through that initial creation phase. And then you start to get into the remediation side and prioritizing assets. Most companies that I've dealt with have never defined what their mission critical systems are. They may not even know what their internet facing systems are. They don't know which ones are the most vulnerable. And there's a difference between finding a system that has 10 vulnerabilities and a system with 10 vulnerabilities that have all been exploited in the wild, and there are known published ways to exploit those vulnerabilities. Those are obviously more important because people have already taken advantage of that vulnerability versus the ones that haven't been exploited and someone has to figure out a way to do it. They're both vulnerabilities, but one takes a precedence. But if you can't define what your mission critical systems are, or you haven't, and you don't know which ones are internet facing or not, how do you tackle this problem? There's typically two schools of thought. Most people are going to go with low hanging fruit or the highest scores, which really comes into this remediation phase. But I think that you'd be ill-informed to make a decision like this. The 5 considerations I put on here, there's an 80-20 rule. This goes back, an 80-20 rule is used throughout all aspects of our life and all aspects of business, but it applies here to security as well. 80% of the vulnerabilities will be taken care of by 20% of the work, or 80% of 20% of vulnerabilities make up 80% of your risk. You can reword this however you want, but this is almost always the case, that you're going to be able to put in 20% of your effort to knock out 80%. That last 20% may take longer than everything else combined. So what you have to do is decide, am I going after low-hanging fruit, meaning I can apply a patch to 200 workstations and that gets rid of 200 vulnerabilities, or I could apply one patch to 5 different systems manually. Well, the one patch to 200 is a lot less work, it's a lot faster, and it might reduce the number of vulnerabilities in your score the fastest. Another school of thought is highest CVSS score. If I go after the thing that's most likely to cause damage, then I'm closing the biggest gaps. Vendor patch availability comes into play here in consideration, because you may want to do one or both or a combination of those two. But as I stated earlier, if the vendor is not making patches available in a timely manner, you may have no choice but to move on to something else. And then take into consideration the testing necessary for the deployment. Most things are going to need testing. You can get away with some basic Office, Windows type, Adobe, web browser type patching with usually a small impact and an easy way to roll back. But when you start getting into server level patching, network appliance patching, where it requires downtime, it can be catastrophic. The last thing you want to do is go to your network device, your router, and then kill communication for the entire organization. And last but not least, verify. I can't tell you the number of times people in organizations will put all of this in place and then not validate the results of what they're doing. And 3 months, 6 months, a year down the road, it looks as bad as the day they started. And it's not because they didn't do a bunch of work, it's because something was broke. And once something was broke, they just repeated a broken process. I can't also tell you the number of times I've seen where someone will use a patch management software, it will send out patches, it will fail on a maintenance weekends, let's say in the month of January. No one investigates why it failed. And when February comes, they tack on February's patches as well as repush January's patches that failed. And then it fails again. Why would March be any different than January and February if you don't go fix the problem? But many departments, because they're busy, will say, I've scheduled it, I've done it, I've applied it, I didn't know it didn't work. So, from a security perspective, if you're going to be managing the vulnerability management lifecycle, this really falls on you to make sure everybody else is doing their jobs. And then the rinse and repeat, just keep doing this over and over and over until you get this under control. Even when it's under control, you get it down to basically everything is mitigated that you can. You've accepted any vulnerabilities and weaknesses that you just can't get rid of, or that the organization is accepting of based on their risk appetite. You're still going to rinse and repeat. It's just going to be a lot simpler, faster, and easier. And then lastly, miscellaneous items. What is mitigation? What is remediation? And how are they different? Mitigation is taking care of some aspect of the vulnerability, but not getting rid of it completely. Remediation is totally getting rid of it. So remediation is often like patching a piece of software and the vulnerability is gone. Mitigation might be shutting off a port so that something's not susceptible to attack, but you haven't actually stopped the attack or fixed the problem. You put like a compensating control in place. The two words get interchanged by non-security people quite frequently, so just be careful in how it's used. Compensating controls are those things that, hey, I can't achieve X in the optimal way, but here's what I'm going to do instead. This is like a patch or a Band-Aid, for lack of better terms. And Band-Aids are okay temporarily, but you want a system that's based on remediation where your Band-Aid is the exception and your Band-Aid is not the norm. Suppression of alerts. A lot of systems can suppress alerts. This makes sense at times. If I know, for example, that I have a host that's going to be shut off in 6 months, I might suppress the alert on that host so I don't see it every month. But you run a risk every time you suppress something that now you're going to miss something. And you may expect it in a certain folder today, but in next month, that folder is being compromised. You weren't scanning it and you're not being alerted because of that suppression. Shadow IT is all of that IT that you just don't know about on the security side of the house. And I don't care how big or small you are, every organization tends to have that until you get a very good set of tools and programs and procedures in place. So that's important. If you don't know about it, you can't scan it or secure it. And then be very careful about the excluding host from scans. A lot of times people will come and say, well, the scanner will break this if you scan it, so please exclude it. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It can break things. Voice devices, for example, are a little finicky. Network appliances, depending on how old and overworked they are, can be finicky. But I, at a minimum, would scan it once in a while and make sure that it's secure to the best of your ability before considering exclusions. You don't want to exclude because you know that it's going to come back with a lot of poor results. That's simply not a reason for exclusions. And on that note, we have about 2 minutes to go. If there are any questions, please let me know. I'm not seeing any in the chat or the Q&A section at this point. But if there are any last minute questions, please feel free to throw them in there. And if there are no other questions, again, as always, appreciate you joining, and we will see you next month. Thank you.